Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Why Do I Care? I'm your host, Toby Favalora.
And I'm Alex Trevay.
And today we'll be discussing Kamala Harris's economic plan. So without further ado, let's get right to it.
And then you can go right into here on the left. Yep, slowly, right here. We're going to bring them over directly to this one.
The French fry, a staple of the American diet and a staple of Donald Trump's diet. For many Americans, the French fry is not merely a food, but Toby, it's an economic indicator. The price of a fry, the price of a Big Mac, for many is the only way that people actually see the results of our economy and of inflation.
That's true. Bidenomics, more like McDonald'nomics.
That was a really bad joke.
I thought it could have hit. No, it didn't land.
It did not land. Unlike Jerome Powell and the soft landing, Toby. Now that was a great landing.
It's going to be a long episode. All right. So just jumping right into it. Yeah, the clip that you heard was of Donald Trump serving French fries as a campaign event. It wasn't, I don't even know how to describe it.
Yeah, it was a man stroking his own ego by shutting down a McDonald's for a full day so he could give out French fries and Big Macs to his supporters who were not, just random people driving by in cars, but instead people who were kind of preordained to be there by the Trump campaign. My favorite part of the whole event was just kind of how relieved Trump seemed when he realized that they have the little, tool for the French fries and it wasn't just someone grabbing them with their hands. I think, before he had kind of worried internally because he's secretly extremely germophobic. But I think now maybe he's a little bit more relieved. Maybe he realizes that those Big Macs and fries that he served to Clemson players after they won the national title really were clean and the real deal.
My favorite thing is that afterwards he's like, I bet the McDonald's stock is going to go way up. But then they have this whole E. coli thing and the stock is way down. I think that's my favorite thing is that he just completely jinxed it.
Well, yeah, because Trump gave them E. coli. Right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, Donald Trump, that is his fault.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Trump, he ruins everything, including the economy. Smooth transition right there. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about Kamala Harris's economic plan. Because one of the most important issues for Americans in this election is the economy. And Donald Trump, he has been able to somehow paint this picture that he is great for the economy, he's smart, he's a businessman, he has never bankrupted a casino, all of these things that it kind of does feed into his image. And in 2016, that's kind of all people knew him for, he must be good, but really isn't that great. And as we're going to touch on a little bit later in the episode, some Nobel laureates agree that his economic plan is really not that great. But we're going to just kind of jump into what is Kamala Harris thinking, what does Kamala Harris want to do, what is her plan? Because I feel like oftentimes in this election, a lot of what Democrats and, the media is saying is Harris, she just isn't Trump. But this is going to be one of her plans, and we're going to dive into her plans and how it's going to help people and how it's going to encourage this middle class to regrow, and that's how it's going to lift people out of poverty, and how it's going to help everyday Americans live for that American dream.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the gripes many people, especially in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, had coming into the beginning of her campaign is that it took her a while to kind of lay out concrete policy standpoints, right? Which makes sense because starting a presidential campaign from scratch 2 months out is not an easy task at all. But, I think some voters are definitely relieved and or more motivated to go out to vote, to volunteer, now that they know that there are kind of these concrete things that they are actually fighting for, that they can, actually go out and be like, okay, this is our legislative agenda, this is what we're going to do, these are where the loans are going to come from, this is how we're going to pay for it, right? I think that's a real relief for lots of voters.
Yeah, 100%. And if you're the Harris campaign, you're kind of looking at some of the polling data and you realize, we're kind of slipping in this group that we kind of thought we could count on, and that would be these black men. And a part of that is directly addressed in her economic agenda as what she calls her opportunity agenda. And what this is it's a plan for these young black men to be able to get started in businesses and able to try to buy homes. And it's really just targeted towards them, not only politically, because I'm sure that was part of the reason that she did this, but also because it's important, and this is going to be a very helpful tool to lift up and to encourage these small businesses, which America's kind of seen dying. So a big part of this plan is that there are these $20,000 forgivable loans for Black entrepreneurs. So what a forgivable loan is that if somebody isn't able to pay it, or if there's certain conditions to be met, the payment can kind of be deferred, or it can be done later, and that's really important for a startup like this. The income isn't going to be necessarily steady. You don't know when you're going to be getting a profit. So being sure that it's going to be forgivable, and if something is to happen, that it's not going to be like a ender for this company, which I think it's important.
Yeah, and I'm also, having the government play that role instead of a private bank or an individual, I think is also really important, just because it lends the entire system a lot of legitimacy, leverage and power that you wouldn't see if you had, these individual hopeful small business owners having to go out and apply for loans on their own, right? Being backed by the government, I think, is extremely powerful in this instance.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And speaking of government kind of getting more involved, what she also has talked about is having some framework for cryptocurrency. And this is something that might be like, why does this go under her opportunity agenda for Black men? Well, the campaign and Kamala were very set on noting that 20% of Black Americans own cryptocurrency. And this is something that it's very important because crypto it's new. It's something that we don't really know the effects of. Nobody really understands it. Like, people can say, oh yeah, the blockchain, I understand it. No one really gets how crypto works, what it really even is. We see these NFT crazes, we see the Bitcoin crazes, whatever. And it spikes up and down so much, and it seems like a market that should have been started to be, regulated a while ago, but it wasn't. And I like how she's going after this and being aggressive with regulating it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much of this is actual regulation in opposed to just kind of making an agenda based around or having cryptocurrency involved with it. I mean, this is unrelated, but I believe we need regulation in the crypto industry. But the reality is that there is a lot of money there that so far has been relatively untapped by political campaigns. It did not play a huge role in 2020 or 2022, but you've seen both sides, reach out to crypto and try to get, their millions, just because it can be the deciding factor in an election. $200 million from the crypto industry can really go a long way for mailers and volunteers and swing states. So like the reality is that there is political viability behind making these appeals that is not just about economic prosperity but also about trying to win this year.
Yeah, and it's something that I'm surprised hasn't been addressed, and I feel like it will likely be addressed along with AI. I bet they try to bundle those two together. It's going to be easier. Like, 21st century, what are we dealing with? We're going to deal with AI and crypto at the same time. But moving on, another part of her opportunity agenda is going to be this investment in education, apprenticeships, and mentorships for these Black men. And this is something that's really important because it doesn't push college on anybody. And that's something that politically it's been run on. You don't need to go to college to have a good job, is what should be the truth. But nowadays we start to see more and more that college education is a requirement for certain types of jobs, and that never used to be the case. And that's really dangerous because student loans are expensive. And what could happen is if you go to college for 2 years, 3 years, you take on these loans, but you're unable to finish college because something comes up, then you're stuck with these loans, and you don't have a degree to help you get out of it. So Kamala saying, you know what, we're going to invest in, education, public education. The apprenticeships is very important because that's going to help people who didn't go to college get into like a trade job or something like that. That's going to be very important. And these mentorships as well. And this can kind of tie back into the loans that she wants to give to like young Black entrepreneurs. Is this is just going to be helpful to have somebody who knows what they're talking about to lead you when you're starting a business. So all these things I really do think is very smart because you shouldn't need to go to college to get an education and to be able to have a job that pays you enough to thrive.
Yeah, and I mean, part of this is also about kind of shifting the backbone of our American economy, right? when we talk about kind of these apprenticeships, these manufacturing jobs, right? We think of the Rust Belt, we think of Ohio, we think of Michigan, we think of Pennsylvania. What we don't, and typically the people in those jobs you would characterize as like white.
Mm-hmm.
So like I think changing that stereotype and being that like, you know, these jobs, these apprenticeships, they can be for everyone, they are for everyone, and the American economy needs them to become increasingly diverse in order for us to keep pushing along in the 21st century, I think is a powerful message that they can send.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And tying on into this is that she also wants to increase the public service loan forgiveness that will be used to try to recruit these young black male teachers. And this is something that's helpful. It's just like a tool that if you work for like the government or a nonprofit or something, it's going to be easier for you to pay off your student loans. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's very important and powerful, because if you're looking at this group of young black men and you say, okay, we want to give them options to not have to go to college necessarily. We want to encourage them to be able to start their own small businesses. If we want to, you know, ensure that they are able to get a public education that is going to help them in their life, which is very clear what this agenda is trying to do. Having this incentive for young black male teachers to go teach young black males, it makes sense, mm-hmm. right? Like if this is the group, if this is so clearly what she's trying to do, is that like she doesn't want to have everybody go to college and she's starting with this group of black men. Like the best way to do that is to have like a black man teach another black man mm-hmm. about these opportunities that he himself was given. Yeah. And I think that this is something that I think it should go to every teacher. I think if you are a teacher, frankly, I don't think you should have to pay for college at all if you're a teacher. But you know, that's going to be an uphill battle. But I think teachers in and of itself is just something that we haven't touched on enough in America. Teachers are important. They're the backbone of this generation and the next generation, and they just don't get enough. And I think this is a fantastic first step.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, at the end of the day, we need more funding for education.
Yeah. So moving on from her opportunity agenda for black men into something that she's going to try to target for every American, it kind of ties back into her former idea for kind of trying to promote small businesses. But what she wants to do is to do a $50,000 tax deduction for these new small businesses, which is going to be an increase from $5,000. So you might be saying like, oh my gosh, you're just adding a whole nother zero there. That's big. Yeah, it is. This is going to encourage small businesses. Small businesses are so unbelievably important, and especially in America, where we as a country thrive and take pride in our innovation, in our inventions. And the best way to innovate and to force innovation is to have these small businesses doing that, because that's the best way. If you're a small business, is to innovate, is to create something new, because that's how you kind of distinguish yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, economic reality is that starting a small business is not cost effective or cost efficient. Mm-hmm. You know, you have a long time when you're running essentially at a loss. And for a lot of people who are, you know, running that kind of mom and pop shop that's not, you know, selling AI technology, but instead they're selling sandwiches, it can be tough to recoup those margins quickly. But, you know, having that $50,000 tax credit can, you know, kind of lift such a burden off the people who are trying to start these small businesses, trying to revitalize their communities, you know, going out, taking that risk. And it's a powerful message to send to America.
Yeah, you talk about revitalizing communities. That's something that I know I have experienced when I've gone more rural places. Like I did the service-ship in West Virginia, and you can tell that what used to be a thriving downtown or a main street was just kind of replaced by like a Dollar General or a Walmart. These big name stores take over the need for a mom and pop. Like if you have a Walmart that's going to offer prices that are so low no one can really compete with it, why would you bother having this? It's because that is how you help your economy, your local economy, is by having the money locally, being spent locally instead of being spent at like a big name store, because that's going to keep it in the community. And that's something that's really important. And also of note, the Harris campaign and the possible administration, they have the goal of in the first 2 years to have 25 million new small business applications, which I think is 100%. Like, I think that's fantastic. I think that's great. I think that's an amazing idea. I think that's something that, of course, they should do and they should try to go after. I think it's like a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
So then moving on to something that it's referred to as like how do Americans really feel about the economy, and that's going to be kitchen table like grocery prices. How do grocery prices impact the economy? This is old, like this is like classic politics. Like how much is eggs? How much is milk? How much does it cost to do this? And the idea that like the prices have really gone up a whole lot, yes, they did, but they've also kind of come back down a little bit. But it's still an issue that impacts many Americans.
Well, yeah, I mean, like every week, you see a new tweet. It's like, oh, I got like steak and like a gallon of milk, and it was $30, and it wasn't because they bought it at like Erewhon. But like. It is an issue for a lot of Americans, and I think it's also kind of tough for people to understand that where we are with grocery prices, we are here because of large corporations, and it's why Kamala Harris is going to work to ban corporate price gouging. That's one of the big points of her economic agenda. And it's also the fact that these prices can never really come back down to where they were pre-pandemic, right? When you have inflationary pressures in an economy, right, those prices get risen, and then you have to go back to kind of a healthy level of inflation, which for many economists is 2 to 3%, but you never see deflation, right? When you see deflation, that means your economy is dying. It's 2008, it's 1929, it's the Great Depression, right? So I think that a lot of Americans should be rightfully angry that their grocery prices are this high, but they also kind of need to look at a wider economic picture and realize that things are going to get more expensive in the future. Prices are never gonna, we're never gonna have milk that's like $1.50 again. But we can still do a lot of things to kind of help out the pocketbook, and make the rich pay their fair share, and stop price gouging the poorest people in our society.
Yeah, and this is just a recurring theme for Democrats, frankly. It's like we don't want everyday people to pay more because some rich assholes want more money in their pockets, and that's what Kamala Harris is aiming to try to do. We talked about a ban on price gouging in the food industry, but also she wants the FTC to be able to investigate this like price fixing, specifically these meat supply chains, and then also supporting these smaller mom and pop little grocery stores, and really a big scrutiny on these like gigantic mergers, because the fact that we are starting to see grocery stores become so heavily monopolized is frankly kind of scary. Like a lot of people do their shopping at Walmart, or they do it at these like big chains, and that's something that is just it's a dangerous path to go down for multiple reasons. But first and foremost is if you have like 3 big grocery stores in America, it's gonna be a whole lot easier for them to just jack those prices up for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's classic cartel economics, and the reality is that Walmart is the largest retailer in the U.S., and even though they didn't start exclusively grocery, they pivoted really since the pandemic on trying to become a grocer that's going to control a majority of America's grocery market, which I think is, again, it's kind of scary, and it's something that we haven't seen before. We're used to big tech having these monopolies, or like the banks. What we aren't used to is only getting food from a few companies, right? Like that feels strange, I think, for many Americans, even if they don't realize that it's happening. So yeah, banning price gouging, trying to break up some of these larger monopolies is really crucial. Big thing they can do is bringing back Lena Khan as the head of the FEC. She has done a fantastic job in regulating our corporations. So much so that some large Democratic donors want her out of her position because she's costing them money, but she's done a fantastic job. If the Harris administration wins and they bring her back, I think that would be huge for this agenda and honestly for the American people.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic of these like inelastic goods, goods that like Americans need to buy no matter what, we can also talk about what Kamala wants to do for these prescription drug prices. Because just like food, you still need your insulin, you still need your eggs. Like you can't avoid that, you can't put that off. So what she wants to do is she wants to cap insulin at $35, which is, I can't believe I have to say this, like obviously, if you need a medication, it should not be it shouldn't be so expensive. Like the fact that we even have this conversation is absolutely crazy. But she also wants to try to limit the out-of-pocket drug expenses to $2,000 per year, and she wants to speed up how fast Medicare can negotiate the price on these drugs, which it's a no-brainer. Like people who need medication to survive should not have to worry about money. like, we have enough money as a society that people should not have to worry about these things. And the fact that we still have to do it is, it's just crazy. Like, it seems like it's honestly like a basic human right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like, Jim Griffin or Mary Sanders here, but, like, Big Pharma has played a huge role in this, in price gouging the American people over the decades. And I don't know that this is exactly standing up to them, but it's doing something, and I think something is, what we need.
Yeah, and I don't know. It feels like the fact that we even need to discuss this is it's disgusting as an American.
Yeah.
Like, people should not have to decide whether or not they should go grocery shopping or keep themselves alive with the medication that they need. People should not have to worry about rationing their own life-saving medication. It's crazy. Like, it's scary that we're at this point in America, democracy, capitalism.
Yeah.
It's honestly frankly scary. Something else that has been a very important part of Democrats as a whole has been housing costs. So just how do Americans buy houses? How do Americans start to create... Because what happens if you buy houses is you essentially... You don't create generational wealth necessarily, but it's a very good investment because that's something that you can pass down to next generations. And that's something that people can live in. That like, yes, it's a home, that's where you live, but it's also financially, it's a tool to be able to survive, to thrive. Because if you don't have to pay rents, if say you buy a house and you're able to pay it off and pass it off to your children, they won't need to pay mortgage on it, or they won't need to pay rent, and that's huge because then that money can be spent somewhere else, and that could be, it's a very helpful investment, which is why it's so important to focus on housing. So what Democrats, and specifically Harris, wants to do is she wants to give a $25,000 down payment assistance for these first-time homeowners, which is huge. We want people, especially young people, to be able to afford houses, and this is something that is going to help. She also wants to build 3 million new housing units in the next 4 years, which is, like, yes, if we have a housing shortage, build more houses, which is something that people really haven't talked about. But also, she wants to give $40 billion for innovation to fund to address this housing shortages. So basically, the two things that she wants to do is give money to first-time homeowners and to pay for houses to be built.
Yeah, and I mean, this is kind of the first time in a long time that we've seen housing as a national debate, as something that we actually talk about on the national stage, and we have not done enough of that in the past, especially in the solidly blue states, where, a lot of kind of like NIMBYist ideas and rhetoric have kind of taken over the public discourse around housing. Just thinking about where we're filming from right now, at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, we're in a city that has, one of the highest rentership rates in our nation. It comes from a long history of redlining, and, other factors that are kind of outside the scope of, just this podcast. It would take a very long time to explain, but the thing is that, like, these small changes are going to make an impact for the people who just need a little bit more help trying to buy a home, trying to get, that piece of social mobility that is just so crucial in really trying to fulfill the American dream.
Yeah, when we talk about American dream, honestly, I think one of the keystones of the American dream is being able to buy your first house. And I think that's something that people have struggled with. A lot of people's parents were able to buy a house, but then you see people go off and they don't have the money to buy a house. And there's multiple different reasons for that, but it's definitely something that we need to address before we can address many of these larger scale issues. So we're going to jump to an issue that it's very important, and that's going to be the minimum wage. The fact that the federal minimum wage hasn't been raised is crazy to me. It should be raised. I understand why some people want to say, oh, it should be up to the states. I understand that state to state it's slightly different. However, if you leave it to the states and the states, they don't do anything, that's when the federal government needs to go in. So to the argument that it should be up to the states, sure, but they didn't do anything. They haven't done anything, so I don't trust them to do anything. Kamala Harris, she has supported raising the minimum wage. She hasn't said to what yet. To the argument that, oh, it's going to cause rampant inflation. No, it's not. No, it's not.
Yeah.
Just it's been proven that's not.
Yeah, and I mean the national minimum wage is $7.25. If you're a service worker, that can become even lower due to just the way that like tips work. Where you have like some Waffle House employees in the South making $4 an hour, which is absolutely blasphemous, right? And it just goes to show kind of the divisions that we begin to see within our country. In a state like Massachusetts or Connecticut, you have a wage that is not yet a living wage, but it's closer. It's $15 an hour. It's $16 an hour. It's something that you can almost live on. Whereas in other states, in Alabama, Mississippi, the $7.25 is not enough to even go through the basic functions of life, right? And a lot of Republicans talk about trying to not be dependent on the government, right? Getting off welfare, all their kind of BS rhetoric they've used in the past. They don't realize that raising the minimum wage is how you do that. It's how you build true financial independence. It's how you make people feel like they have control over their own destiny economically, which I think a lot of Americans don't feel right now. So raising the national minimum wage should absolutely be a priority for this next legislative session and for the Harris administration.
No, yeah, 100%, because we do all this talking about how do you help people. There's only so much you can do, but being sure that they are paid more is the easiest. Like, that's the easiest step, and the fact that we haven't talked about it. The fact that inflation has gone up, but we haven't increased the minimum wage is crazy. The fact that the cost of living has gone up, but we haven't increased the minimum wage is crazy. The fact that it's harder for people than ever to survive on the wage that they get, but we haven't increased the wage in years, that's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bare minimum that they should do is they should, A, increase the raise, but then 100% they have to tie that to inflation.
Yeah.
It has to increase with inflation. It has to. Or else what's the point?
Yeah. And also in thinking about, a thing like Social Security, right, that a lot of Americans rely on, that is something that is tied to inflation. Not as well as it should be. It cannot support being, or Social Security itself does not keep up exactly with inflation, but it raises, right, with inflation. So thinking about, that we already have these kind of methods and things in place, that like this is kind of common sense. Like, this is something that we can do, we know how to do it, and we should pass it.
100%. So what we're going to do now is we're going to compare the Harris kind of what is she doing and how is that compared to Biden and Trump. So for Biden, it's pretty similar, right? They're both Democrats. He picked her to be his running mate for a reason. It's not because they're like completely, it's like, it's not like a Joe Manchin picking an AOC type. Like, they're pretty similar. That's why they ran together. However, she is going to be more aggressive specifically in housing and investing in these communities that just kind of need a little bit of help. And we see that in, her plans.
Yeah, and I mean, also the reality is that Biden had to build back, build back better after COVID. He passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which, lowered child poverty in this country for the first time in generations. But, they just have kind of different contexts of what they need to do. Biden had to build back. Now Harris has to improve.
Yes, no, 100%. And as for Trump, he focuses on raising these tariffs, and he wants to cut taxes and regulations. This is something that it's become the new norm for the Republican Party. It didn't used to be. Like, they never really wanted all these tariffs. They thought tariffs were bad for free trade, but Trump went in and he changed that, and he flipped the entire Republican Party on his head, because that's what he can do. But then cutting taxes, cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid to give tax cuts to his rich buddies is something that, he did in 2018. That's what that's how they won the House back. He's going to do it again, no surprise, because that's Donald Trump for you. Like, that's who he is. And the Harris's plan would increase the deficit, that is true, by about $3.5 trillion, which is, everyone's going to be like, oh my God, like, yeah, the Republicans are right, like, Harris is going to increase the plan. Trump, what he's going to do, that would increase it by $7.5 trillion. What, like, that's like nearly double it. So the fact that Republicans are like, oh, like, if we elect Harris, like, the deficit's going to go crazy. Trump's going to make it go even crazier, because you're making it hard, like, you're cutting taxes. And like, I don't know what really the logic is behind. I can't understand him. I
mean, in reality, it's a step away. It's no longer fiscal conservatism, right? What you're seeing now is fiscal populism, and conservative populism, right-wing populism, but still populism, which is, like, wider political wave that's washed over, us in the last generation. But like, the reality is that these are economic thoughts that are kind of untested since the early 20th century, right? Like, we're talking about tariffs. This was stuff that William McKinley talked about. That him and, William Jennings Bryan had debates over tariffs and over, the gold and the silver standard. And they aren't things that we should talk about right now in a world that is so starkly different than it was 100 years ago. So it's time for us to have new economic conversations that actually revolve around our, political realities about the free trade globalized world that we now live in.
100% completely agree. So we're going to take a quick break. Once we're back, we're not only going to discuss the Why Do You Care section about the podcast, we're also going to talk about how Harris was endorsed by several Nobel laureates. So we're going to just jump right into it. Kamala Harris, she was endorsed by over 80 American Nobel Prize winners in physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. The key message of this was that because 2024 is so important, the future of science and technology in the United States rests on this. And they warned that Trump would hinder and get in the way of this progress that America has been kind of known for in science and technology, and specifically this really slow reaction to climate change. So they go against Trump in what they claim to be his anti-science stance. And this is really important as to the why do you care aspect of it is Nobel Prize winners are pretty widely accepted as the smartest people in the world. If you have 80 of the smartest people in the world endorsing somebody for president of the United States,
yeah, that feels significant, yeah.
That's very telling. That's very telling. So, I don't know, the fact that we still have this conversation after many media outlets, and I don't know. If you care about this, listen to the Kamala Coalition episode that we did a while back. But yeah, so jumping into the Why Do I Care section of the podcast, Alex, why do you care about what Harris wants to do economically?
I care, and you should care about what Kamala Harris wants to do economically, because it's going to impact everyone's life every single day, right? Anybody who hears this, 99.9% of Americans do not make over $400,000, right? Those are the only people who the Harris campaign has pledged to, put new taxes upon, right? It's time for us to realize that we need change for middle America and for the poorest people in our country, that we need to go back to reducing child poverty, to being a nation that is the leader in our world economy, right? Where we are responsible with our economic policy, where we think about the actions and not just about how it sounds, right? I know that, raising tariffs might, sound cool to some people in Pennsylvania and Ohio who have lost their manufacturing jobs, right? Because the steel industry has gone away. But the reality is that is going to hurt hundreds of millions of Americans every single year. It's going to come out of their pockets. The reality is that Donald Trump's economic plan is dangerous for America and its future, for its people. Kamala Harris is sensible, it's doable, it's pragmatic, and it's realistic for the time that we live in.
Yeah, 100%. So, since the beginning of America, since the 1800s, the biggest divide hasn't necessarily been race. It has been social economic status. And that is part of why race has played such a big role. That's a completely different conversation. But in short, white people kind of use, we're better than other races as a tool to ensure their social economic status. But the fact that we're still having the same issues that we had at the founding of our country, it's scary, it's telling. That's something that's concerning. That we, as Americans, as a society, haven't figured out how to take care of our poorest Americans and how to handle our richest Americans. How do we stop the richest Americans from becoming even richer while the poorest Americans haven't gotten up past the level, right? The fact that we have people who have not multiple cars, multiple private jets, yachts, mansions. Nobody should have all that stuff until we have the poorest Americans being able to afford their life-saving medication, to be able to ensure that their children will be safe. This is something that, frankly, it hasn't been addressed in so long. In economics, the reason that so many Americans feel checked out from today's political system is that they say, oh, it doesn't work for me. What the biggest tool that America has in changing how people view the government working for them is economically,
Mm-hmm.
right? If Harris is able to be elected, if she is able to implement these strategies, people will be able to see the difference. The trust in government will be restored. It's going to be colossally changing, and there's no way to really overstate that. Like, this is so unbelievably important. It's going to change how people act, how people behave, and how people view their government. So that's why you should care, because this is arguably the most important election, and this is arguably the most important policies that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode. As always, go to whydoicarepod.com with the episode transcripts up there. We also have links to all the social media. In addition, we also have links to YouTube, in which we are going to post a video version of this podcast in addition to an audio, this podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your day.